Welcome to the YouTube channel on poverty and culture. Our channel is dedicated to understanding how culture affects poverty and other social problems. Through discussions with our guests, we hope to understand that connection more deeply and thus find better answers. Our host is Larry Mead, a longtime scholar of poverty and welfare reform and the author of the recent Burdens of Freedom. Our initial ideas about culture come from this book, but the discussion may take us in new directions. Our discussant today is Heather MacDonald, the Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor of City Journal, and a New York Times bestselling author.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm Larry Mead. I'm a professor at New York University. And what I'm going to do at the outset here is give a brief description of what we mean by cultural difference, and then we'll get Heather's reaction. The basic idea is that we're interested in how culture affects our social problems. We think that this is a problem that really hasn't been addressed. We haven't really reckoned with the cultural differences that we face in this country and indeed around the world. Cultural difference really means differences in what people think life's about, what they regard themselves as doing and trying to do in their lives. And the great fact about America is that it's divided between a dominant culture that came from Europe, which is individualist, and I'll say more about that, and then another culture that comes primarily from the non-Western world. The minorities, which we think of typically in racial terms, is different from the mainstream. From this point of view, what's important is that they're culturally different. They're not coming from Europe. They're not coming from the Western world. They have quite a different idea of what life's about. And many of our difficulties stem from this fact. Now, what are the chief differences? Well, the great fact about the dominant Western culture in the US is that it's individualist. Most people pursue goals that they personally have decided. They go after these. Their lives proceed from the inside out, from what they want towards seeking to change the world in various ways. And in contrast to that, the non-Western groups are coming from a culture that's more cautious, which typically seeks to adjust to the world rather than seeking changes. And therefore, it's more passive, more reactive, rather than active and proactive. And the other major difference is that Western morals are based upon an idea of right and wrong that is seen as principled and universalistic. Westerners internalize notions of right and wrong, kind of like the Ten Commandments, as absolute truths, which they should apply in all circumstances. They don't always do that, but that's what they think they should do. And so the structure of morals is very much abstract, internalized, and moralistic. Whereas in the non-West, the structure of morals is a lot more conformist. People do what other people expect them to do. They don't have an idea that morals are absolute and universal. Rather, they depend very critically on context and what other people expect. And that makes a big difference in how they adjust to a country like the United States. Now, the other two things to say that are really crucial, one of them is that neither culture is better in any general sense. There's no way to say that the West is different from better than the non-West or vice versa. Rather, both approaches have different strengths and weaknesses, and we can talk about that. And the other major fact is that culture has no necessary connection with race. We tend to think of minorities in terms of racial difference, but actually, from this point of view, what matters is cultural difference. They're coming from a different way of life, and that creates both opportunities and problems for us in trying to unify the country. So that's roughly where we begin. And I want to get Heather's reaction to that basic idea.
Well, thank you so much, Larry and Jason. I'm honored to be with you. I find your argument intriguing and compelling, especially at a micro level. The more it expands outwards to explain global differences, I find myself knocking up against exceptions. But right now, we are living through a attack on Western civilization, a race-based attack on Western civilization by the Black Lives Matter movement that is coming out of and glorifying a culture that is wholly pathological, which is the inner city culture, the oppositional culture,
Yeah.
that emerged in the 60s and grew thanks to being fed by corporate capitalism to spread
Yeah.
the hip hop rap. So in that case, I think that absolutely what's driving the persistent Black-white, Black-Asian divides in America that are being used as a battering ram against everything Western, i.e. white, is absolutely a cultural problem. Nevertheless, I find myself wondering about the specifics of your argument. Your biggest problem is obviously Asian success, and you put Asians in the basket of non-individualist collectivist cultures, and Asians are within the United States, they're whooping everybody's ass, and the rising dominance of Asian countries elsewhere and China. You say in your book that, well, with the right policies, you can succeed. The Asian countries can succeed with the right policies. I'm quoting you verbatim. Well, that kind of begs a lot of questions. Where do those policies come from? Why can they overcome the cultural differences that you adumbrate? And then you speak about South American immigration as also embodying the collectivist passive culture that holds people back. But of course, South America was colonized largely by Catholics from the European West. And if you're claiming that cultural norms last for generations and generations, then those same, I wonder whether you're sort of really talking about a Protestant versus a Catholic worldview, and we're reiterating the Protestant work ethic argument of Max Weber here, but the South America was colonized by the West. So why then is it lagging?
Okay, let me react to several things you've said and briefly. Roughly, the non-Western groups that you mentioned would include Blacks, Hispanics, Asians. They're all different in how they react to America. That's certainly true. But all of them have, what they don't have is the individualist temperament of the West. The Asians may seem to be very successful, but in fact, they have a hard time after they get out of school. As long as school provides a structure for them, then their life is rather much like what it would be in Asia, where basically education is about rote learning and you do what the teacher says. But in America, once people get to be in the college level, we expect them to make their own arguments and to challenge authority. Indeed, I reward Asian students highly if they do that. But I find that they are reluctant to do it. They're much less likely to question authority than people from a Western background. And they also have significant problems succeeding after school, because once you get out into the business world, or indeed in the academic world, to make any kind of mark, you have to do something distinctive. You have to stick your neck out. You have to take risks. You have to be inner-driven. And this is something that Asians have significant difficulty doing. Now, there are obviously exceptions they go off in Silicon Valley and they make money. Yes, they're typically from the Indian subcontinent rather than East Asia, typically, where there's a stronger Western influence. But East Asia, the Asians have a significant problem. They really have a difficult time succeeding, even though it's not very visible, because they don't have the same social problems that we see in Blacks and Hispanics. Now, the Hispanics, just briefly, although they were colonized by Spain and they speak Spanish, the Spanish never had a strong influence on the culture, and they never, with the sole exception of the Cubans, who are primarily European in background, the other Hispanic groups are essentially Native American. They're coming from Middle and South America, and they actually reflect the very non-Western viewpoint of Native America, which we also see in the United States. This is a culture of conformity to tradition, focused on adjusting to outer demands. It's a culture of considerable complexity and has a lot of value, but it doesn't have the individualist temperament that allows you to get ahead in America. And also, Hispanics lack, because they don't have the inner-driven morals of the West. They have a hard time in America because we expect that kind of attitude here, whereas in the non-West, where they come from, they actually do better because there's much more external authority that maintains order. And one of the ways you see that is when Hispanics move from, let's say, Mexico into the United States, their families start falling apart at that point, not before. And that's also true for Blacks. Blacks are coming from a background which includes slavery, Jim Crow, and in the background, Africa. Africa is the most collective-minded, least individualist culture in the world. And slavery and Jim Crow perpetuated a culture of conformity to external authority. And then, but after slavery, and especially after Blacks moved north from the South into the North, they enter a society that takes for granted an individualist temperament. And they don't have that. And so they are now not restrained by either external or internal notions of authority. And that's why you have this breakdown of Black society that occurs in the 60s and 70s. They have been liberated in a way that allows for total chaos to take over. That is not the American way. The American way, rather, is an individualist culture in which there's considerable notions of self-restraint, the idea that you must behave well and observe certain norms of good behavior, which are seen as generally adequate. And you do that, and then you get ahead. But just like the veterans say, freedom is not free. Freedom depends upon internal restraint, self-command. And that's what Blacks typically often don't have today, because they're coming from a different background where the source of authority is external. And they have to acquire the individualist temperament before they can really get ahead. And that, in fact, is happening when you look at the Black middle class. About a third of the group, I would estimate, is going over to an individualist culture. And they're doing just fine. They have a temperament just like you and I would have. The fact that they're Black is incidental because they are, in fact, behaving as an individualist would do. They're not a problem at all. They're a great gift to the country. But the kind of disorders that you describe in your own work having to do with crime represent what happens when you have a population that doesn't really know what to do and hasn't been told either externally or internally. And so you get chaos. And it's a terrible problem. And in your own work, you very definitely criticize the authorities for beating up on the cops and blaming them for the problem. That's certainly correct. But the cops also face a really serious problem. Even if they weren't making mistakes, and even if they weren't being beaten up on, they face a problem, a population that doesn't really know what to do. And therefore there's simply disarray at a profound level, which you would not have in an individualist culture.
Well, it seems like you're sort of romanticizing American culture, but on the other hand, it may be that it is necessary to operate at very high levels of generality that ignore objections one might have, and that there's value in that. It seems to me that you romanticize America and the idea that we're all moralistic and assuming, as you say, what you call the burdens of freedom, and not moved by external pressure and conformity. And obviously, there's the idea that one should question or rebel against authority can be taken way too far, as we saw in the 60s. It's also, given that Asians, I think, have the highest income of any other group, it's hard to say that they're failing once they get out of school. You're absolutely right that the managerial elites in Silicon Valley are Indian American rather than Chinese American, but I predict that in its research capacity and military might, China is going to continue to catch up enormously with the United States and perhaps surge ahead. On your point about Latin America and culture generally, a book that is a real microcosm and laboratory experiment of these culture clashes that I recommend to everybody. It's an extraordinary book, is by Richard Henry Dana, called 2 Years Before the Mast. Yes. This is a chronicle of a Boston Brahmin student who his eyesight was failing at Harvard in 1840, and he thought that if he somehow farmed himself out as a sailor, that this would help his eyes. So he sailed on a merchant ship around the tip of South America, and the ship landed on the coast of California and tacked up and down between San Francisco and San Diego, collecting cowhides to bring back to the East Coast for tanning. And it is the most extraordinary description of the different cultures that were found in the pre-gold rush days of California. The Mexican culture, the Polynesian culture, the German culture, the Russian culture, the entrepreneurial American culture. He portrays the Mexican culture as very much a Spanish aristocratic culture of the men sort of not working and the females showing themselves off and highly conscious of rank, but basically dedicated to leisure and display. So I don't get, again, a strong sense there of this is infused by indigenous blood. This seems to be
at the time you're talking about, the Spanish element would have been uppermost. And you're quite correct, and you're reading it, Dana. By the way, it is a great book. If you're a sailor, as I am, you read that one really for its graphic descriptions of sailing around the Horn. I mean, the very fact that the Europeans set out to colonize the world and indeed explore the world at a point when they had nothing but sailing ships to go on is quite extraordinary. The Europeans took amazing risks to come to America, to explore the rest of the world, to develop colonies. Spain, after all, was one of the least progressive and countries in Europe itself, yet it nonetheless forged a large empire.
Right.
The ethos of that empire was entirely different from that of the European elements on the eastern seaboard, including both the British and the French. They were more modern, more individualist, but nonetheless, the Spanish created an empire. Now what happens in today's Hispanics is the uppermost element is no longer the Spanish element, it's simply the Native American element coming from middle Europe, middle America, Mexicans, Central Americans also. These are elements which are only one step away from Native America before the Europeans even arrived. And they have a tremendously hard time in America because the cultural difference between that way of life and the mainstream American way of life is enormous. And they really have tremendous difficulty. And I've seen that among my own students. Hispanic students don't lack for intelligence. That isn't the problem. They rather lack for organization, their ability to maintain their families, and the families they come from are often falling apart. They have all kinds of problems at the family level, almost as severe as Blacks have had recently. And a lot of that is due to the fact that neither of those groups really knows how to make an absolute obligation in their heads. That isn't what they're really able to do because they're used to external authority. And it takes several generations. So there's studies that show this. It takes several generations for a non-Western group coming to America to assimilate the individualist temperament. And after that, then they do much better because now they can say, here's what I want. At the same time, here's how I am self-limited in various ways. And I do what is rational to get ahead, and I don't get in trouble. And that's much harder for minorities today. So, and our system assumes an individualist temperament, so we do not have.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we actually have stopped insisting on conformity and assimilation. You know, it's hard to think that the Sicilian peasants and the Irish who came into Ellis Island in 1900 had strong individualist ethoses. These were also collectivist societies. Right. And we insisted that they conform to American norms. The individualism now, which is, well, you know, let everybody be, is not a good thing. And again, I mean, I understand the need to make these broad generalizations, that we need to have an ability to categorize the world in beyond just fine points, but one also sees in say 19th century British novels the force of conformity, small village life, insisting on the adherence to certain norms of family structure, or the gossip, trying to crush the individual. So, but you may say, okay, that's fine at a micro level. Nevertheless, at a broader level, what we stand for is greater individualism. And I would say, with regards to Black culture, it was, when there was still de jure and de facto segregation, you had much more conformity to bourgeois norms. There's a great book by Alan Ehrenhalt, The Lost City, that describes Bronzeville in Chicago in the 1950s, where the Black residents there created many middle-class institutions for themselves, insurance companies, pooling risk, took pride in weddings, in local businesses. And all that fell apart ironically, with the destruction of segregation and the need to compete with whites. And that was giving rise to the rise of an oppositional culture, arguably rationalizing the real. I don't know. But
the middle class elements you're describing are.
What are these? How long does it take for culture to stay pervasive? You say several generations. Well, Blacks have been here for generations.
The Black story is actually one of assimilation. If you look back to the 19th century, the bulk of the group is living under slavery and then Jim Crow. So they really are not really in America culturally. But there is a minority that manages to go to school, and especially to go to church. The schools and the church create an individualist elite among Blacks. And these are the groups that become the leaders in the inner city communities that you describe in the 20th century. They're also the lawyers who challenged Jim Crow. And because they were inner-driven, because they had their own goals, they were vastly more formidable than the bulk of the group, which was entirely passive and reactive. So although the leadership is middle class and is individuals, and that is still true today, the bulk of the group is not. And otherwise we could not explain these disorders that we see. And the irony that I see is that the activists that we now have, the Black Lives Matter movement, is led by people who actually are thoroughly individualist and often quite distinguished. These are very talented people, and they push ahead. They're doing just what Americans have always done. They're thoroughly American in their attitude, but they're speaking for a group that is not like them, which is on the whole much more passive, much more troubled, gets itself in trouble. And that's one reason why their demands are so forceful, because we have this enormous cultural gulf between the leadership and the followers, if there are followers. That is not the way it was during the Civil Rights Movement. Then you had a leadership that was coming out of the Black church, which was certainly individualized. But the bulk of the people behind them were much more orderly than they are today. And
but I would say gangster culture, these kids that are going around committing drive-by shootings, that are stealing, that are going on rampages through stores. In one sense, that's completely individualistic. They're out for themselves.
Self-destructive.
They're out for themselves. They are not conforming to bourgeois norms. And so I would say their problem is that they are too much after themselves. One could also say that in African kleptocracies. Is that a collectivist society where you have these thugs running the country, as I'm not going to use the phrase that Trump used, but he was absolutely right. That's also very individualistic. You're
that's more traditional authority. That's what you see. The authority patterns you see outside the West, including in Africa, are primarily what you find in the non-West, throughout the non-West. You have a traditional elite, often hereditary, as you mentioned, which rules without accountability. There's no legal structure of any importance. The leadership simply has power and keeps power. It serves itself. It isn't disciplined by a set of political norms about serving the society. That comes in the West because only the West really has a civic culture. There is a bit of an exception in the case of Japan, an Asian country that became well governed without Western influence. That's very unusual. Generally speaking, you don't find a civic culture of any importance except in the Western world, because it depends upon the moralistic psychology of the West. You have to have the moralism before you can defend government institutions against corruption and misrule. And you don't have that in Africa. And you
I guess, I mean, the crime rates in Japan and other Asian countries are just zero. Social capital is enormous. Families are strong. And I would say, I'll take that, when you can have a tsunami and there's no looting, everybody's helping each other. And again, it seems to me you're at a very, very high level of generality about US culture and our current elites. Maybe again, by contrast with the non-West, they look like they're moralistic and changing. There's turnover because we don't have an ingrained aristocracy. But at this point, I'm not sure that our current elites are anything to be emulated, or their values at a more micro level. And you're always insisting the values you're talking about are individualism versus collectivism. But the whole woke culture is certainly about enforcing a conformity to a particular narrative that is, I would argue, an utter fiction about this country being endemically, pervasively white supremacist.
Yeah. Well, that attitude, that ideology, to me, is a rather pure expression of non-Western culture, because the non-West assigns power to the environment rather than to themselves. And therefore, they can't imagine that they can do anything. They have to wait for the world to change. And so you have this paradox that people who claim that America's racist nonetheless look to a racist America to save them. They're looking to the environment to provide the initiative which they themselves will not provide. Now, again, the leaders are themselves individuals, but the culture is passive and reactive, and it isn't able to help itself. You see, that's why it's so difficult to solve. Even if the leaders were doing more rational things, we're not undercutting the country. I totally agree with you about that. Even if that were not the case, then, and indeed, policy was a little bit more conservative and more effective 10 or 20 years ago than it is today. Even if that were not true, we would face a terrible problem, because the rest of the group is not able to assert direction. They have to learn how to do that. And that's what takes several generations. And I think right now we're going backwards, because the ideology is an ideology of powerlessness. That's absolutely opposed to the culture of the West, which is a culture of mastery. American culture traditionally was a culture of mastery, where individuals collectively and individually went out and changed things and built this enormous and powerful country which dominates the world. Furthermore, commentators in the early 19th century, before this country had even gotten on its feet, were predicting that it would dominate the world. And they were doing that really on cultural grounds. They were saying it's the temperament of the country that allows it to give this enormous impulse forward. And that's what we've lost, which we really never had for the non-Western groups, because they come here interested in survival, or in the case of slavery, they came here involuntarily, of course. And that isn't what life's about for them. They're interested in getting to a country that's better ruled than where they came from, but they don't necessarily take on the burdens of freedom, which are very demanding.
Yeah, I don't know. You also need a just explanation of why these different cultures evolved and when they did evolve. I was just looking at a history of the French Revolution by Pierre Gaxot, and he's rused the rise of individualism and sees traditional European culture as not at all individualistic. But Europeans perceived us not as these internalized virtue-driven people, but as highly materialistic. They are that as well. That is what distinguished Americans, is that all they thought about was making money.
That's true.
Now, that may be synonymous with being individualistic. I don't know, but Tocqueville did not think that America was an individualistic culture. He talked about the conformity of democracy. It was aristocracy that was traditionally viewed as the seedbed for evolving highly distinct individual personalities. whereas Americans, de Tocqueville thought, though they took responsibility for their communities for sure, and the famous creation of civic associations, nevertheless, he felt that democracy enforced a race to the bottom as far as the ability to express individual differences and aspire to greatness.
That's true. He does say that. And I'm not saying there's no conformist element in American culture. I think there certainly is, and you're hitting upon that. But it isn't like the non-West, where the conformity is much, much stronger. In Asia, particularly in Asia, you have a culture in which people really don't think of themselves as individuals at all. They are part of groups, and they are taking orders from the group and from higher authority. And that's why Asia is very strong in dealing with an emergency where it's clear what you have to do. But Asia is not very strong in any kind of innovation. What Asia doesn't do, and the West does very well, and especially America, is to create a new world, to create a new structure where you never had it before, or even a new company or a new technology. And you look at, to me, an emblematic figures here are the Wright brothers, who invented the airplane. I mean, they had nothing, they had no background at all. They had a very little training, very little money, but they invented the airplane and changed the world. And that happens all the time in America. It does not happen in China. It does not happen in Asia. It doesn't happen in Japan either. Japan is a very non-individualist culture, even though it's a formidable country. I mean, this is a country which has generated power on a massive scale. We have to have great respect for Japan. And they show that there's more than one way to get rich and powerful, and the American way is not the only way. I accept that, and my book is full of recognition of the Asian way. But it's based on a completely different culture with different strengths and weaknesses. And we don't have all the strengths and weaknesses. In terms of collective effort for an agreed goal, the Asians are superior, no question about that. But in terms of innovation and the ability, and what is really distinctive to the West is the ability to combine order and freedom. Because we have these moralistic ideas of good behavior, we can actually behave well and defend public institutions while at the same time having the freedom to innovate. And that is really, no other culture has been able to combine those things in the same way. And that's what makes America so very, very formidable. That although we may appear to be overtaken by various rivals, we have been in the past, a number of countries have challenged America for world leadership, but they haven't been able to overcome the capacity to innovate and the capacity to, once led well, it takes strong leadership to do it. But once you have strong leadership at the center, America can move mountains. And we have indeed done so in a number of cases. It isn't our natural, we don't do it all the time. Individuals most of the time worry about what they want to do. But meanwhile, the country goes forward because it's well governed, because we have the rule of law and so on. That combination of order and freedom is unique to the West. And really, Japan is the only non-Western country that achieves it at a high level. I should also mention South Korea, Taiwan. There are a couple of other, and of course, Singapore. There are a couple of other Asian countries that have done very well, but they did so under strong Western and American pressure. They didn't really do it autonomously. The Japanese are the only Asian country which actually created a well-governed society without Western influence. And that's because of special features of Japan as a country. So we really are unique in this capacity to combine order and freedom. And that is what I think is hardest in some ways for our own people who come here from other countries. They think of America as a free country. And it is indeed a free country, but it also makes these presumptions about good behavior and responsibility that go with being free. Much of the burden of freedom comes from the very fact of being free itself. And the things that you decide to do are the things that burden your life. I mean, the life that you're living, for example, as an international commentator, your life is full of obligations. My life is full of obligations. A person who has ambitious goals is, for that very reason, burdened by those goals. And that's why American society can seem to be enormously burdened, because we accept our own goals and pursue them. And that's the life which the underclass is just the opposite. For them, all the pressures are external. It's all the things that they have to do from the environment. as being economically poor, having all kinds of other problems. That's the burdens that they face. They're all external. Whereas for the West, and unique to the West, the burdens are primarily internal. And that is what makes us so special and why we often don't understand ourselves, because we don't see the burdens we bear. We have been brought up to bear them, and we don't see them. We think it's easy. We think freedom is free. No, freedom is burdensome.
Well, that to me, it has I think that is a sort of a religious argument. It sounds to me like you're influenced by your Christianity here. And you talk about America needing to take up the burden still and lead the world. And I'm not sure why that is the case. So that whole rhetoric I find a little bit puzzling. But again, you're at a level of generality. In one sense, you could be seen as rationalizing the real of, well, now we have America out front. What about the rest of Europe? There are differences across Europe. What is this West that you talk about? How does that culture continue? There are differences between Greece, Portugal, and Denmark. Is that all the West? Is this all a single ideology? And this language of the burdens of freedom, I really don't know what that means today on a daily basis.
Well, the Europeans are different in that each country has a separate history, and they're not all the same. Some of them, the British and the French in particular, have the largest influence in the outside world, probably. Germans also, Russians. There are these separate traditions within Europe. But if you compare Europe to a whole, to the rest of the world, it is still a universalist, it is still an individualist culture. And in fact, the problems which Europe is having with immigration are very similar to the problems that we're having, especially with the Hispanic immigration. Because the people coming from Africa, from North Africa, also from the Islamic world into Europe, are people who are accustomed to external authority. They're used to being told what to do by other people. And they have also enormous capacity to endure the unendurable. I mean, these are people whom one has to admire for their fortitude in simply getting to the Western world. However, they don't understand freedom, because for them, life is about survival. And they therefore are not really compatible with Europe until they internalize the norms of freedom. And that takes, again, several generations. So you typically find in France, for example, Britain as well, there are much higher levels of crime and other social problems among the immigrants and people coming from the non-Western world. And they're pretty much the same, regardless of where they came from in the non-West, which shows you that it's ultimately a difference between an individualist and a non-individualist culture. And of course, we discuss this entirely in terms of race, because the bugaboo is racism, which means that you somehow think a person of a certain race is less capable, inferior in some way from a person of another race. But in this understanding, it isn't about race at all. It's really all about culture, about ways of life. And that any race can become individuals, provided they internalize the way of life that goes with that. And over time, they do that. They do that. And you see that in this country and elsewhere. But it takes a while, and it's not overnight. And it isn't enough to ask the dominant culture to be more tolerant of the newcomers who are coming in, as if all that matters is the fact that they're racist or not racist. No, even if they were completely non-racist, they would have a problem with a culture that is so passive and reactive, and which doesn't set its own goals and has trouble making use of the opportunities which America or Europe provide. That's hard for them, because again, those opportunities presume a certain culture, a certain way of life. And until you take that on, you're not really able to profit from being in America or Europe. But we don't talk about this, and therefore you don't understand what's going on.
Well, you have this situation where you have weak governments in sub-Saharan Africa. You have corrupt government in India, and you have authoritarian government in China. And in each of those cases, the people who are reacting to their environment have to make their own way via external constituent forces. And only in one only sees in the West and in America the impetus to break out of one's circumstances and create something new. I don't see that happening, Heather, for example, in China. You don't see the Chinese population rejecting the government's authoritarianism, notwithstanding Tiananmen Square, and nor do you see it really in India, and in sub-Saharan Africa, the population is subject to the strongman, but you just don't have what Larry's defining as an inner directive that overcomes the external environment.
Well, we did have revolutions in India. You know, you had a revolt against colonial power. China revolted against its own past. So they haven't been completely supine. But I guess I would just say, you know, John Derbyshire would ask the question, what are the upstream variables? What is driving these cultural differences? Are there other types of differences, genetic, between populations that may also explain rates of success? And wouldn't necessarily bet against China in the future, thanks to the intelligence of its population. So conformity and individualism have different values and different consequences depending on the state in which you find yourself.
You mentioned the issue of whether there are physical differences. That's something that has come out of the work of Charles Murray in particular. I'm just now reviewing a couple of books by Charles which bring up that question yet again. And on Charles's own estimation, although there are physical differences between the races, they don't really account for the differences in intelligence that we now see. Some connection may well be drawn in the future as research progresses. We may find some way to attach differences in IQ to something about the physiology of groups. But my overall reaction to that discourse is that even if it's true that there are some physical differences, they're altogether less important than the cultural differences in determining which group and which country goes ahead. In Charles's estimation, I've heard this elsewhere, the IQ difference between blacks and whites is about one standard deviation. That's about 15 points. Okay, that's significant. It's going to mean that in a perfectly fair and race-blind society, there will be relatively fewer blacks in very cerebral jobs than other groups because they won't have that very high end of the distribution. That could be true, okay? But in terms of the overall group, the cultural difference is vastly more important. It's much greater to start off with. The difference in way of life between the black poor in America is not, and the mainstream, is not one standard deviation. It's 3 or 4 standard deviations. It's gigantically greater. And therefore, it's much more significant in explaining our problems than anything about IQ. So I see the IQ debate and anything about physical race differences as a red herring. This really is not important.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we can sop up, you know, if you could get rid of the ghetto oppositional anti-acting white culture, you would solve an enormous amount of the economic disparity gap, obviously.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, it does raise the question of where do these cultures come from, and are some of them rationalizing the real? I don't know. Was it just this miracle that somehow the West, independent of any kind of genetic characteristics of the populations with regards to deferred gratification, future orientation, and yes, IQ, developed an individualistic culture, whereas other areas of the world did not?
In my book, I have a chapter about where the cultural differences came from. And we can't say a whole lot about that. The one thing you can say is that the distinctive individualism of Europe arose only there. It's not arisen really anywhere else in the world. And it arose very early. It arose really around the time of the fall of the Roman Empire. That's when Europe is taken over by Germanic tribes that come into Europe from the east, not all the way east, but from Eastern Europe. And they somehow had an individualist temperament. And that temperament changed Europe into what had previously been a backwater, into an era of enormous dynamism and change. And from that point on, from the fall of Rome roughly until right up to the present, you see Europe changing constantly. And the change is from the bottom up. It's not driven by leaders. It's driven by ordinary people seeking to improve their lives. One aspect of it is religious change and the Reformation and the Enlightenment. There are these intellectual movements, but it's a broader fact than that. It really goes to ordinary people seeking to change things to improve their lives or improve the society and service. And so Europe has this protean, constant changing character that isn't found anywhere else in the world. In the rest of the world, you have static societies that really don't change much at all. They're still important civilizations. China is a very important civilization with enormous sophistication and important achievements in the arts and so on, philosophy and so on and so on. But it isn't protean, it isn't dynamic. There's nothing about China that changes really. And when there is change, and there has been change recently, it's driven from the top, not from the bottom. And it's Europe's unique dynamism. And in fact, all of the theorists of history, including Marx, for example, Hegel is another, they basically generalize from the Western experience. They say this is what should happen everywhere in the world, but has not happened everywhere in the world, really only in the West. And then that's the culture that comes to America. And Americans tend to say we're normal and minorities are abnormal. They're somehow exceptions to the rule. But worldwide, the opposite is true. Actually, they are much more numerous. The individualist population of the West is vastly outnumbered by the non-individualist populations. And because of immigration, it's plausible to say that the entire Western world is under pressure from the non-West. It's not a violent pressure. It's not military. But the fact is, because of the breakdown of government in the non-West, you have millions of people seeking to immigrate to the West. And they're coming not, I don't think, primarily to seek a life of freedom, but simply to find the rule of law and to find order in some basic sense. And the failure of government in the non-West is one of the great facts of cultural difference. And it just happens to be that only really the West has found a way to reconcile freedom and order. And so the immigration question is, I think, likely to dominate politics for the foreseeable future. There's nothing equal to it except maybe global warming would be the other case. And how do we deal with these millions of people? If they were allowed into the Western world, they would destroy it. We can't accommodate everyone. And indeed, among the issues that aren't addressed in this book, and maybe I'll get to another book, is the theology of this. I mean, theology of the Bible certainly says that outsiders who come in and seek some kind of welcome by a dominant society have a moral claim to get that the sojourner is somebody who should have protection. But in the Bible, the sojourner is only a few alongside the society they're seeking to enter. Whereas in the world today, those who seek to immigrate are larger, enormously larger than the society they're seeking to enter. And so we can't allow endless immigration, because to do that would be to destroy the culture that makes possible the reconciliation of order and freedom. And this is a great dilemma. We haven't begun to grapple with it because we haven't really dealt with the cultural problem. The people coming are not like the Europeans who first settled this country. Indeed, they didn't first settle it. The first settlers were the Native Americans. And their culture is also non-Western. It's a very interesting culture, but it's certainly different from Europe. And they had really no hope when the Europeans flooded in. The Europeans just took over. And this shows the mastery, the tendency of Western culture to dominate. It's not pretty at all. It's quite to me, a tragedy, really, what happened. But it shows which culture is able to dominate. And now we have to somehow preserve that culture in order to keep the world from just flying apart.
Well, I definitely agree that there is something extraordinary about the compulsion to explore and people, as you mentioned in your book, setting out across the Atlantic to discover the world. It is an extraordinary thing. And yes, it had its underside too, with conquest of peoples, not just nature. And we do take that for granted. And, now you have people from Africa that barely get themselves into an inflated dinghy, that not even the future preparation to be able to make sure that you're going to get through the Mediterranean. And to bolster your point, the assumption is we're just going to put ourselves out there and somebody else is going to rescue us and take us to land.
Yeah.
So
See, in fact,
I would also say that, there's cultures that never developed literacy, never developed the wheel, no written system. So that brings me back, maybe to group inheritable differences that also contribute to this. You talk again about, Europe was ordinary people seeking to change their lives. Again, I have a hard time with what degree of microscope to look at this when you think of the history of Europe with feudalism, serfs, Russian serfs. You put Russian into the West with its individualism. Every Russian novel is obsessed with what do we do with the serfs? How do we reform agriculture? The seeming impossibility of making reform stick. And so I would say that the development of Europe and technology and science was not necessarily ordinary people until you get, I guess, the rise of a bourgeois class. But started out with aristocratic thinkers developing theories of.
But what's remarkable is the presence of leadership throughout the society, not only at the top, whereas in the non-West, the leadership is always at the top. You really don't find another case of a self-generating change. And that is what we think of that as universal, but it's not at all universal. It's exceptional. And much about American West is exceptional. And that's what we really have to preserve that, even as we're somehow, I think it's virtually inevitable that we're going to see a revival of imperialism in some form, because the pressures from immigration are so strong that the West is going to be driven to export order because we can't import all the people who want to come to the West. So we're likely to see, and it's already happening. American military exploits today, and it's true also for French and the British, are primarily returns to empire, really the use of troops to impose order on situations that are not able to impose order themselves. So the Europeans have to do it, which really means the Westerners have to do it, which really means the moralists have to do it, the people who are able to conceive of a general purpose and execute it through some rational action. That isn't something that's normal. That is something found really only in the West on a large scale. And we're going to have to do that in order to prevent the world falling apart. So what I find burdensome about this personally is simply that it means that people like ourselves are going to go on having obligations vastly greater than we can ever discharge. And if you think, I ask myself, when does my turn come? When do I get other people to worry about my problems? Well, that may never happen, where it's going to happen only in private life. It's not going to happen in any collective or public life. And I think Western elites are already facing this. I say at the end of the book that although we have enormously gifted people in the American leadership, a rising share of them will find their lives dominated by the need to deal with the less orderly parts of America, which means the low-income population. They're going to take more and more effort because they're growing relative to the rest. And we somehow have to make it possible for them to eventually assume the orders of freedom, the burdens of freedom. And that is a tremendous task. And meanwhile, we have all these countries on the outside that are falling apart and which require order somehow. So I don't think the West is having an easy time. And I don't think people that are typed as privileged like ourselves are actually privileged. On the contrary, we have responsibilities vastly greater than we can discharge. And that isn't anyone's doing. That's simply fate. as I say, my last line in the book is, if we have a quarrel, our quarrel is with God. This is the fate that we've been given.
Well, before this last annus horribilis of COVID and Black Lives Matter riots, I was absolutely thinking along with you that the issue of third world migration was going to be the defining issue of the 21st century. And that if it goes unchecked, the West will be swamped. So I agree with you on that. Looking at a more micro level, we see in the West the growth of collectivization of risk, larger and larger government social programs, the attempt to, as I say, socialize risk away from individuals. So these differences are at micro levels. It's not at the broad brush of black-white contrast that you're talking about.
No, it isn't.
Anyway, I think this has been a good discussion.
Okay.
And,
thank you for your time. Our time's up. Let me just make sure there's nothing that's very pressing that you need to say, or Jason, Michelle, anything you want to add, Jason? Okay.
No, it's been a great discussion.
Yes, I'm very pleased at your time. We will produce a version of this and you will hear that in due time. It will not be 2 years, I promise you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Get it on the tube. Okay, so we'll talk again, sure, and good luck in your current endeavors, which are never ending. And I expect to read more about that in due time.
Okay, great.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.